The Apollo has had quite an evolution over its 85 years. The doors opened in 1934, and it was one of the few theaters that you could see people of color on the stage as well as in the audience.
When you think about the stories and the artists that graced the stage that we're sitting on now, it's immense.
Fast forward, as we think about the Apollo today, we are really the only performing arts center in the United States that focuses on the African American narrative.
It's a big part of our mission, not only to become a home for artists, but also a home for culture and culture building. As we think about the future of the Apollo, we hope to transform and build a new 21st century canon where African American voices do sit at the center.
The range of our work, the theater, the comedy, the dance, the festivals, I think it inspires.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this WNYC and Apollo Theater production of Apollo Uptown Hall, MLK, Activism, and the Arts. I'm Terrence McKnight, classical music host on WNYC's sister station WQXR, and your master of ceremonies for today's program. From New York Public Radio's Race and Justice Unit, Jamie Floyd.
At the end of 2021, we lost the trailblazing feminist social critic, poet, and author, as well as activist, Bell Hooks. She referenced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. throughout her public and her private life. In 2002, Bell Hooks said of Dr. King, quote, "In strength to love, he speaks about standing in the shadows of fascism and the importance of protecting free speech relative to our democracy." It is at that intersection of creativity and dissidence that we find Dr. King, artists and athletes. Black bodies jumping from slave ships into the Atlantic Ocean, the enslaved in revolt, actions of the abolitionists, individual and collective opposition to Jim Crow and Black codes, organized civil disobedience, defiance amidst the threat of death, nonviolent protests, Black power. Evidence of creative maladjustment, the natural organic opposition to injustice, as Dr. King described it. Creative maladjustment is expressed through the speech of Frederick Douglass and lyrics of Billie Holiday, through the pen of Toni Morrison and the poetry of Langston Hughes. It's expressed through the publications of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones. Creative maladjustment is expressed through the lens of Gordon Parks and Spike Lee, photographers of the civil rights movements, and Darnella Frazier, who recorded the video that proved that George Floyd was murdered. Through the musical careers of Prince and the bombast of the conscious hip hop artists, through the paintings of Jacob Lawrence, sculpture of Elizabeth Catlett, and the printmaking of Wadsworth Durrell and Afrocobra Collective. Creative maladjustment takes form in art, as it does in athletics. Curt Flood's fight for free agency, the raised fists of Smith and Carlos, Ali's jab and his Vietnam protest, Mahmoud Abdul Rauf's national anthem stance, and Billie Jean King's demand for recognition and for better pay. Colin Kaepernick's protest of police brutality, taking a knee against racial inequality in these United States. In September of 1967, roughly 55 years ago, Dr. King insisted that, quote, "There are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted." Our 2022 celebration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is centered on the call for creative maladjustment. We begin with a reflection on Dr. King and the arts with host and managing editor of The Takeaway, Melissa Harris Perry. She's joined by the Honorable Andrew Young. Young served as mayor of Atlanta, a member of Congress from Georgia, and U.S. ambassador to the United States. But long before these official political roles and titles, Andrew Young was executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and a close confidant of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And now I am joined by Garrett McQueen, executive producer and co-host of the Triloquy podcast and president of Trillworks Media. Garrett works at the intersection of race and classical music. He's an equity consultant, a guest speaker, a curator, and a presenter at the intersection of classical music and race, and serves on the board of the American Composers Forum as the Equity Committee Chair. He maintains leadership advisory positions with the Black Opera Alliance, the Gateway Music Festival, and the Lakes Area Music Festival. We're so pleased to have Garrett McQueen with us today. Garrett, thank you so much for being here. How has classical music intersected with activism? Because that's surprising for a lot of folks.
Yeah, the intersection of Black activism and classical music is a very long history filled with the names of far more people that I could share with you here today, but I'll offer a few examples of what this has looked like over the past couple centuries and how it all remains relevant today. So first and foremost, I have to acknowledge that activism among classical musicians predates Black Lives Matter, it predates the Civil Rights Movement, and even America as a country. Way back around the year of 1729, there was a man born on a slave ship headed from the African continent to England. His name was Ignatius Sancho. Now, Ignatius would grow up to be one of the leading figures in the abolitionist movement over in England and was even the very first Black person to vote in a British election back in 1774. So in addition to being that sort of activist and even an author, Ignatius Sancho was a composer of a vast number of compositions for string orchestra. Now, these pieces weren't regularly performed for many years, but today there are ensembles all around the world that use his music as a means of remembering the slave trade as a global scourge, not just one that impacted the United States. It's a dark part of our human history that was overcome through the work of all sorts of people, musicians included. Now, if you fast forward about 100 years or so, you can find another Black Briton whose work lived at the intersection of classical music and activism. He was a man named Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He only lived to be 37 years old, but he managed to get a lot done in his relatively short life. First and foremost, Samuel Coleridge Taylor was a broadly respected composer in his own right. He had a number of pieces that really hit big back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of those works was called Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. That work was such a big hit that it led him to an American tour so that he could learn more about the diaspora, and that fed into his beliefs when it comes to Black people and Black civil rights. In the year of 1900, he was the youngest participant at the first Pan-African Conference, and then in 1904, he was received by President Roosevelt at the White House, which, as everyone can imagine, was pretty revolutionary in itself for a Black man back in those days. Today, his music continues to be performed and celebrated, and in my opinion, his music serves as one of the greatest artifacts that we have when it comes to exploring the intersectional history of Pan-African thought and Western classical music. Now, of course, it wasn't just the men who were doing the good work over history. In 1913, a woman named Margaret Bonds was born. Her father was an activist and her mother was a musician, so she grew up thinking about those ideas in tandem. Her most famous work is a tune that many folks know called He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, but a work that lots of folks are returning to by Bonds these days is her 1964 Montgomery Variations. This work was written in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. and the tireless work done by Black folks down in Alabama fighting for civil rights and specifically voting rights. She also has a Christmas oratorio called The Ballad of the Brown King, which is also beginning to get more and more play in concert settings. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Margaret Bonds' teacher, the folks she learned music from. As an aside, I was really lucky to get to study with someone Black in the early years of my development, and so was Margaret Bonds. It proved very impactful. As a high school student, Margaret Bonds studied piano and composition with two black musicians, in fact, a man named William Levy Dawson and a black woman named Florence Price. So I'd like to share a short excerpt from a holiday show that I produced for Kwanzaa back in 2020 to give everyone a taste of her music. This excerpt features a bit of Florence Price's single movement piano concerto as performed by the Chicago Sinfonietta featuring pianist Karen Walwyn.
Very beautiful, Garrett McQueen. Let me ask you how the continued legacy of racial justice and activism in classical music is being engaged today, if it is.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that the work of fighting for Black rights through Western classical music has never died, thankfully. So, and there are many ensembles, institutions, and even more individuals who are continuing this fight. So I'll name a few here. The first group I have to name is the Gateways Festival Orchestra. The Gateways Music Festival was founded back in 1993 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina by Arminta Hummings Dumasani. The inaugural concert actually included a violin concerto featuring Louis Farrakhan on solo violin, something that a lot of folks don't know. Well, Arminta later took the organization to Rochester, New York in 1995 when she became an associate professor at the Eastman School of Music, and the group has been going strong up in Rochester ever since. In addition to the Gateways Music Festival, I have to mention the incredible work that's been happening in the world of opera, including the Metropolitan Opera's premiere of Fire, Shut Up in My Bones, which marked their very first staging of an opera by a Black composer last year. I had the great pleasure of flying to New York and seeing it myself. Now, on the activist side of opera, I'm really proud to be a leadership council member of the Black Opera Alliance, which works to get more Black voices, more Black perspectives, and even more Black compositions on opera stages across the country, just so that things like that isn't a one-off, but something that becomes really normalized in the field. You have other organizations similar to the Black Opera Alliance that have remained active, including the International Society for Black Musicians, whose mission is to cultivate an international community of Black musicians through education, performance, collaboration, and the advancement of their work, and to facilitate the unlearning of centered whiteness in the scholarship of music, specifically classical music. Additionally, institutions like the American Composers Forum and New York's own American Composers Orchestra have shifted in recent years toward racial equity. So it's really exciting, and there's a lot going on.
Let me ask you how people can help to continue the momentum of achieving racial equity in the world of classical music.
Yeah, that's a really big question, but what I see as the greatest means of continuing the momentum is acknowledging the Negro spiritual as America's first classical music. We have to understand that with the exception of musical traditions codified by indigenous people, there's really nothing more musically American than the spiritual. So as the spiritual evolved over the generations, it was separated from the musical traditions codified by folks who were not Black and in turn deemed as something different than classical music. But I believe that we all have to reconsider Black music in all of its iterations since the spiritual as something classical. Not only will this inspire more Black activism from more of our communities, but it'll also transform the genre of so-called classical music, as I like to say, into something that reflects more of who we are as a human race today and in the future.
We welcome the return of Jamie Floyd, this time joined by sports curator at Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, Dr. Damian Thomas.
So we want to look at the long arc, the long moral arc of activism in sports, history, art today. And as I understand it through studying your work, the government, the US government, actually used sports as they used other forms of art, jazz, for example, as an instrument of quote unquote effective propaganda. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I wrote a book called Globetrotting: African American Athletes in Cold War Politics. And what I do in that book is I look at the central role of US segregation and its negative impact on US foreign policy during the Cold War, the period from the late 1940s through the mid to late 1960s. That's the period that I cover. And by 1949, half of Soviet anti-American propaganda was about US race relations. And they were saying to nations in Asia, in the Middle East, and Africa, why would you want to align with the United States when they treat their people of color so poorly? And so in response to that, the US State Department began to send prosperous African Americans abroad to try to counteract the notion that the American dream wasn't available to African Americans. And so they sent a number of jazz musicians, they sent a number of athletes on these goodwill tours. And what was interesting about it was a number of the athletes did not know that they were going on State Department sponsored tours, because the State Department would often partner with different sports organizations to send these tours abroad. And so the US government hoped that by sending these men and women abroad, they would counteract notions of racial inequality. But what happened in this program is that these programs couldn't compete with the images of the violence from Little Rock, from Montgomery, in other places. So ultimately, the US had to change. And one of the forgotten stories of the civil rights movement was how influential that international pressure because of the Cold War was, which led to reform in the US. Certainly, there were people who wanted to do the right thing, but it was also the cost of racial segregation and racial oppression to US foreign policy that helped fuel change in America.
Is there a timeline that we can see as we walk through the history of athletes in this country and their activism?
Sure. You know, every generation has its own fight and its own way of engaging with racial oppression. If we think back to the era of Jack Johnson, this is also the era when there are a number of lynchings of African Americans as well. And we have to remember that the majority of African Americans who were lynched because they were economically prosperous. They refused to be pushed off of their land. They refused to sell cheaply. And so their towns and their businesses were burned and they were often murdered. For African Americans of that generation, Jack Johnson, who flaunted his wealth and his fame, was a symbol of fearlessness. He was a symbol of somebody who was not going to be cowed and swayed because of the threats that came against him. And so he's a symbol that we are going to stand, we're going to fight, and we are going to be here. And so for the next generation of athletes, you get Joe Louis and Jesse Owens. And that's a generation where they are trying to figure out how to navigate racism through good behavior, through appealing to the hearts and minds of white America. And it's based on this idea, can you achieve success and equality by being deferential, by being a good citizen, by being someone who is not confrontational around the race question in hopes that you would change the hearts and minds of white America? So in some ways, that generation believed it was their burden to change white perceptions of African Americans. And then you get the generation of the civil rights movement, who then rejects that idea and says, no, what we have to do is confront racism. We have to confront the laws. We have to confront these notions of inequality, and we have to stand up to them. Athletes like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, athletes like Jim Brown and Muhammad Ali are confronting the system. Then by the late 60s, the doors of confrontation sort of closed with the white backlash. And then we enter the era of Michael Jordan. And I think this is an important era, thinking about the post-civil rights generation. Their charge is not to protest, but it's rather to achieve. How do we take advantage of all of these opportunities that were created by the civil rights movement? How do we walk in these halls of education and the best colleges that have been opened? How do we walk into corporate America, Xerox and IBM, and achieve? And so that generation is trying to figure out how can we best use the increased opportunities that we've gained out of the civil rights movement. And so Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and others really are creating an economic path and an economic kind of empowerment that becomes really important, particularly for this current generation. Many times when we look at LeBron James and the other athletes today, we see a clear line back to Jim Brown, to Muhammad Ali and others. But we also have to see that line from Michael Jordan, because while many of the athletes in the 60s and 70s were persecuted because of their involvement, these athletes today have created a system where they can be politically active and it doesn't cost them economically because they've created these independent streams of income. And so I think both are crucial. The activism from the 1960s and the economic advancement from the 1980s and 90s, we see both of them evident in this current generation. And so that's how I see this evolution of athletes and their social role and function.
But then is Colin Kaepernick at the end of that timeline? Is he a turning point to the next generation? Where do you see him fitting into that timeline?
Certainly, Colin Kaepernick is about this new generation, which gets economic empowerment and also gets politically active and engaged. Colin Kaepernick lost a lot of money because of his inability to gain another NFL contract. But he's also been able to create alternative streams of income. He's also been able to kind of take his activism and not suffer as much as he would have in the past. So Colin is the athlete that really brings this moment to the fore, particularly for football players. And he's really the guy who says, look, we can't stand by and think that our presence and play on the field is disconnected from what's going on in America.
Do you find in your work at the museum that people have a very in-depth understanding of Dr. King and his work, his legacy? Or do you find, if you encounter people talking about Dr. King at all in your work, that it is lacking in this time?
I think, unfortunately in society, we have allowed Dr. King to be deduced to the I Have a Dream speech, which is a very powerful speech where he's reimagining American society. But Dr. King was a political theorist. He was a man of action. People often think of nonviolent direct action as being passive, but it's actually very active. And what you're doing is confronting the system and saying, you want us to be out of these spaces, but we're going to be here and we're going to occupy them. One of the other things that we often forget is, much like today with Black Lives Matter, one of the key sort of things about Black Lives Matter is how they use social media, which is a new medium. And Dr. King was masterful at using television. And those moments of the water hoses and the police dogs and the protesters being beat, weren't moments that just happened. Dr. King went places where he knew that he could provoke the sheriff or provoke the mayor so that he could get these images that would be shown all across the nation on news and all across the world. And so it was a tactical decision. So he's an incredible tactician, a man of immense bravery that sometimes gets forgotten. One of my favorite stories of Dr. King was when he was leading the Montgomery bus boycott. You know, he was 26 years old. He was an outsider. And the reason they asked him to lead it was not because they necessarily thought he was the best leader. It was because they didn't want to suffer the repercussions of the other leaders in the city of leading this effort and what it would cost. So they said, we'll have the young guy lead this. And so his wife is pregnant. He's leading this effort. And he was trying to figure out what to do. You know, I'm finishing my PhD. I got a pregnant wife. They had tried to bomb his house. And he was thinking about giving up and leaving the movement and going back up to Boston, finish his schooling. And he got a threat, a phone call, and he didn't know what to do. And he said he heard a voice from God. He heard the voice of God say to him at midnight in the kitchen, Martin, stand for justice, stand for truth. And from that moment forward, he continued to fight, even though he received numerous death threats, even when he had so many opportunities to leave the movement and say, I've done enough. He could have went to any university and taught. He could have joined any church and just been a pastor. But despite all of the threats and all of the hardship, he's someone who continued to dedicate his life to social justice, knowing that he was going to be killed. And I think we have to remember that about him.
I can't think of a better way to finish our conversation than with that memory of Dr. King and that admonition to remember his legacy and his work and the full measure of it. Damian Thomas is the curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture for sports there, and also a published author and obviously a wonderful speaker. And we thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for spending a bit of your time with us today.
It is a pleasure, and thank you so much.